Alright, welcome back to another video of Davian's collection of VHS DVDs, games, and more. Today I'm going to be doing my March 2022 VHS collection. Now I have 35 VHSs because I got more of them off camera, including those two How the Grinch Stole Christmas videos. One is the one read in the beginning of Brooke video series, and one is that movie, animated movie. And the real new arrivals were these 5 Bob the Builder videos. To the Rescue, Pets in a Pickle, Bob's White Christmas, The Big Game, and Busy Bob and Silly Spud. It's going to be freaking epic. Now let's get on to the video. Starting off, it's this VHS from 1987, which has this Christmas special, I Love Lucy, in it. I tested it out and it works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Remembering Maryland, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is this Dodge City video, works fine with no issues whatsoever. Recently, I destroyed this Perry Mason video because it has problems with the picture and issues. Next up is this John McKinney thing that works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Disorder in the Court with the Three Stooges. This thing works perfectly fine, but no issues whatsoever. Next up is No Deposit, No Return. That works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the Tribute to Michael Landon, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Whoa. Next up is, the country music. That works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is this Back to the Future 3 movie, which has commercials from December 1992. This VHS works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is a Walton Wedding that works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is this 1997 Traction video or Sony thing that works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is In the Line of Fire that works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is this Long Home Run thing. Don't know the name of that one, 1991 movie, but it also has One Life to Live in it. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Last for the T120 videos, American Idol with Carrie and Bo, that works fine with no issues whatsoever. Now we move on to movies. Starting with is this Random House version of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, with this extra story, If I Ran a Zoo. It worked perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is The Cat in the Hat Comes Back and These Other Stories. It works perfectly fine, except it's missing the top, which made it have sound issues. Next up is Ren and Stimpy and the Stupidest Stories. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Rugrats and the Santa Experience. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Arthur, this movie from Warner Brothers that works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Rugrats and a Rugrats Vacation. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Jingle All the Way. It works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Barney's Great Adventure, the movie. It works perfectly fine, except the tape doesn't want to insert a lot. Next up is Blue's Clues and Storytime. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Everest. That works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Blue's Clues and Blue's Big Treasure Hunt. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Blue's Clues and Blue Safari. Works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas movie animated edition. That works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Pokemon the Movie 2000. I've been beginning to play Pokemon Go, and this is why you hear that theme song in my drop test videos. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Rugrats in Paris the movie. That works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Dr. Dolittle 2. That works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Bob the Builder and To the Rescue. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Bob the Builder and Pets in a Pickle. That works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Bob the Builder and Bob's White Christmas. That works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Bob the Builder and the Big Game. That works fine with no issues whatsoever. And last but not least is Bob the Builder and Busy Bob and Silly Spud. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Those are my first 5 Bob the Builder videos. Now that's going to do with me with my March 2022 VHS collection. This is Davian's collection of VHS, DVDs, games, and more. Thank you for watching. I hope you like, subscribe, and comment. Yeah, once you go to YouTube here, to go to YouTube. And you can subscribe to this channel for more awesome videos. I'll see you again in my next video.